Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. On this episode, I'm going to do my first top 10 video, and it's going to be the top 10 albums of the 80s American rock underground. The 80s is a decade that evokes images of neon and hairspray, MTV videos, and big commercial selling acts like Michael Jackson, Bruce Springsteen, Prince, and Madonna. For those who grew up in the classic rock era, say from 1965 to 1975, this decade of commercialized pomp seemed completely culturally vapid. However, I'm going to argue that the 80s was the richest decade for rock music. There was a plethora of diverse sounds with artists exploring the limits of the rock genre. However, this cultural renaissance was not part of the mainstream, but was found in the vast underground. Throughout the United States, there were numerous independent scenes where people were pushing the musical boundaries after hardcore punk had empowered young people to pick up instruments again. There were so many great albums that were recorded at this time. Here are 10 that really stand out for me. They are not in ranked order, and I recommend all of them. Please check them out. They are really worth it. The first album on my list is Double Nickels on a Dime by the Minutemen. This was the band's third album, and was a double album with a total of 44 songs. The three-piece was part of the Southern California hardcore punk scene, but right from the start they were playing a different kind of punk. Inspired by groups like Gang of Four and Wire, they created a unique spin on the short hardcore punk sound by integrating all kinds of different time changes. Now, for this album, they were inspired by the Pink Floyd album Ummagumma, where each band member would get their own side, where their vision could be followed. D. Boon gets side 1, Mike Watt gets side 2, George Hurley got side 3, and they all worked together on side 4, which they called Chaff. None of the songs go barely over 2 minutes, but within the short time frame of the songs, one can hear punk, jazz, funk, folk, all mixed into a smorgasbord with both surreal and politically charged lyrics. The band's sound would go on to influence everyone from the Red Hot Chili Peppers all the way to math rock bands like Slint. A highlight track for me is the dynamic The Glory of Man. One can hear the influence of this sound on post-hardcore bands in the 90s. The album was recorded between November 1983 and April 1984 and was produced by Ethan James. It was not released by SST Records until July 3rd, 1984, so it could be released at the same time with another double album, Zen Arcade by Husker 2. Speaking of which, that is the next album on my list. Zen Arcade is an underground masterpiece. On their first two releases, Land Speed Record and Everything Falls Apart, Husker Du played a blistering hardcore at breakneck speed. With Metal Circus, they started to integrate more melody into their sound. But this album took everything so much further. Imagine a rock opera done by a hardcore punk band. Now, while there is hardcore punk on the album, there is also more melodic sounding punk, piano interludes, acoustic numbers, and pure psychedelic jams. The fact that the majority of the tracks were done in one take is mind-blowing. The whole thing was done in one 40-hour session in October 1983 for only $3,200. The concept was based around a narrative about a young man who leaves an abusive home, joins the army, joins a cult, falls in love, has his girlfriend OD on drugs, figures out that he can't change his situation, and in fact, all of this might have been a massive dream or hallucination. The sound of this album would be massively influential in everything from the Pixies to Nirvana to various emo core bands. I cannot recommend this album enough. I wish the tracks here would get put in rotation on alternative rock and classic rock radio. The album was released on July 1st, 1984, along with Double Nickels on a Dime on SST Records. For our third album, we are going to choose one by a band whose leader founded that record label SST, and that band, of course, is Black Flag. There are many albums I could choose from the band, including Damage, My War, and In My Head, but the album I'm going to choose is Loose Nut. For me, this album captures the vision that Greg Ginn had for the band. The band has their dirgy sound that they explored on My War and Slip It In, but brought intense time changes and dissonant leads that were influenced by everything from Captain Beefheart, King Crimson, the Mavanusha Orchestra, and even maybe the Grateful Dead. Henry Rollins sings the Dukowski-penned lyrics on isolation and sexual frustration. He would go on to make a huge career out of this. This album is one that should be more widely known in the band's catalog. The sound here would influence grunge and noise rock bands in the early 90s. It was released on May 14th, 1985. For the next album, we're going to look at another LA band, The Gun Club. and I'm going to select their debut album, Fire of Love, from 1981. The sound on this album is absolutely fantastic. Taking from that sound that had been created by the Cramps, the Gun Club took the sound a step further and immersed themselves in the blues. But this was not the 70s blues rock with endless solos. This was punk rock meets pre-war blues, creating a garage version of the American Gothic. Every track on this album is great. Tracks like Sex Beat, Preaching the Blues, She's Like Heroin to Me. But for me, the highlight track is For the Love of Ivy. And in fact, the song might be referencing band member Kid Congo Powers, who helped write the song but left to play with the Cramps, and is referencing the guitarist Poison Ivy. Best line, "You look like an Elvis from hell." This album set the tone for where Nick Cave would travel musically after the Birthday Party, and it kind of showed where the sound of someone like John Spencer and what he would put together in the 90s. Frontman Jeffrey Lee Pierce was a troubled soul whose contribution to music should be really much more widely known. Now we're back to SST Records for our next album. Choosing one album by this band was difficult, but I had to go with 1987's Sister, and of course the band is Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth, they used like old guitars like the Fender Jaguar or Jazzmaster, and they'd string them up in all kinds of ways that they would create these unique soundscapes. The album was recorded with Walter Sear on a 16-track studio in Hell's Kitchen, New York. Now, the album is based around the life of sci-fi author Philip K. Dick, who dealt with serious mental health issues throughout his life. The band created a cerebral sonic landscape that stands on the shoulders of, say, like the no-wave scene and the Velvet Underground, but the sound goes beyond those influences to create something truly unique that is chaotic, yet melody oozes out in places and gives it the sound structure. For me, this is where the band peaked. Highlight tracks include Schizophrenia, Stereo Sanctity, the cover of Crime's Hotwire My Heart, and Cotton Crown. But the truth is the whole album is a highlight. If you're curious about Sonic Youth, this is the one you should start with. The next album is Samhain, or Samhain 3, November Coming Fire, again by Samhain, or Samhain, however you want to pronounce it. And yes, I will finish the series I'm doing on Danzig's career. But I gotta tell you, this album is a highlight in that vast music career of Danzig's. The band sound here merges like noisy post-punk goth with kind of like the aggression of punk and hardcore and the kind of thickness of metal. There was no other band playing this kind of sound, and they took kind of like those horror lyrics that were referenced in goth songs and pushed them to like violent extremes and included pagan imagery. A standout track is To Walk the Night, is a crooning ballad for the alienated and dispossessed. Danzig would take his music in a very different direction with his next album, and the band named after him. But this album really shows how a band could take from different genres and create a really unique musical sound that has aged very well. It was released in February 1986 on Danzig's own Plan 9 label. The next album is Let It Be. No, not the album by the Beatles, but the third album by the Replacements. The band had started as a snotty punk band, but soon started to incorporate classic rock, power pop, and singer-songwriter influences. Now on this album, this is really the one that stands out for me in their career. While there's comedic punk songs like, Tommy Got His Tonsils Out or Gary's Got a Boner, Paul Westerberg really shines as a songwriter with songs like I Will Dare and Unsatisfied. You get an atmosphere of the underbelly of working class Minneapolis that would be hidden from the glitz of the 80s mainstream. And Westerberg's raspy vocals and dark irony-filled authenticity prefigures the sound Kurt Cobain would bring to the mainstream in the early 90s. It was released on October 2nd, 1984, and the album has been cited as being not only one of the greatest rock albums of the 80s, but arguably one of the greatest rock albums of all time. The next album on the list is the sole studio album this band released during their initial run, and I'm talking about Verses by Mission of Burma. The band prefigured so much of where indie rock would go in the next 3 decades. They created a sound that was inspired by British post-punk and, underground bands from America like the Stooges and Pere Ubu. On Verses, they fully realized their sound by merging the pop melodies of Clint Conley and the avant guitar sounds of Roger Miller. Sound engineer Martin Swope added sounds and tape manipulations, and it's this kind of avant garage sound. This interplay creates a sound that's it's both approachable, but it's challenging challenging at the same time. Highlights on the album include the tracks Secret, Trem 2, The Ballad of Johnny Burma, and That's How I Escaped My Certain Fate. The album was released on October 11th, 1982 on the Ace of Hearts label. The next album is Over the Edge by Wipers. This album shows Greg Sage at the peak of his songwriting powers. He plays throughout the album with a reckless yet disciplined intensity that is epic in proportions. The guitar has a clean distortion that is filled with reverb and just drives the listener forward. His vocals have a raspy desperation to them, and again were very influential on Kurt Cobain, as a lot of the albums on this list were. From the opening title track, the band is relentless yet controlled. Highlights include Over the Edge, Doomtown, Romeo, and No Generation Gap. Now, all of these contradictions in their sound, it creates something very unique, and Wipers are definitely a band that should be more widely known. The album was released in 1983 on the label Brain Eater. The final album is Album Generic by Flipper. Rather than play at breakneck speeds like their contemporaries in the hardcore scene, this band slowed down the sound and focused on being noisy and having lyrics dripping with sarcasm and nihilism. It would be this approach that would influence not only bands like Black Flag when they slowed down, but eventually Seattle bands like the Melvins and, again, Nirvana. Highlights for me include the songs Ever, Life is Cheap, Way of the World, and of course, Sex Bomb. The album drips with a dirty sounding feedback guitar, like it's been recorded in a basement. I don't feel like taking a bath after listening to it. This is another album that would have a huge influence on where noise rock would go in the next couple of decades. You know, by taking this approach, Flipper were exemplifying the true spirit of punk, and were holding up a middle finger to the conformity of the hardcore punk scene. The album was released in June 1982. There are numerous albums that could have made this list, as it was, in my opinion, again, the richest time in rock music, just not in the mainstream. All of these albums, in my opinion, are essential listening and are a good place to start if you want to become familiar with what was going on in the underground in 80s America. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, comment, and or subscribe. Let me know if you have any favorites from the 80s rock underground.